The deadly world. On a planet far from Earth, there was a world unlike any other. It was a place where survival was a constant struggle, and danger lurked around every corner. The sky was a strange, deep red, filled with clouds that never seemed to go away. The air was thick, heavy, and dangerous to breathe without special equipment. Even the plants and trees were not like anything seen on Earth. Every leaf, every vine was designed to survive in a world where nothing could afford to be soft or weak. This was a world that seemed to hate life. The ground was rocky and uneven, filled with deep cracks and strange, glowing minerals. These minerals emitted poisonous gases that could kill a human in just a few minutes. The weather was unpredictable, with violent storms that could strike without warning. Winds strong enough to tear buildings apart would howl across the land. Lightning, unlike any lightning on Earth, would crackle through the sky, striking anything that dared to stand in its path. The temperature could rise to unbearable heat or drop to freezing cold, sometimes in the same day. There was no time to rest, no time to relax. But this deadly world was not empty. It was home to many different creatures, each more dangerous than the last. Some of these creatures were giant, their massive forms towering over the landscape. Others were small but deadly, hidden in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. Their claws, teeth, and venom were designed for one thing: to kill. The creatures of this world had no mercy. They attacked without warning, without reason. They did not care who you were or what you were doing. If you were in their territory, you were nothing more than prey. In this hostile world, humans were the newcomers. They had only just arrived, brought here by a mission they had no choice but to accept. The humans were explorers, scientists, and settlers sent to this planet to study its resources and possibly make it their new home. But what they didn't know was that this world had never been meant for human life. It was a place where every day was a battle for survival, a world that seemed determined to destroy anything that tried to live on it. Despite the odds, humans had built colonies here. They had established small settlements where they could gather resources, build shelter, and try to live. But even in these colonies, danger was never far away. The humans had to constantly be on guard, watching the skies for storms, the ground for cracks, and the shadows for predators. It was exhausting. Many had died in the first few years of settlement. Some had been taken by the deadly creatures, others lost to the unforgiving weather. But the humans did not give up. They adapted. They learned. They built better shelters, stronger weapons, and developed new ways to survive. But still, there was always the question: how long could they keep this up? The planet was merciless, and the humans were running out of time. The colony was starting to fall apart. Supplies were running low, and morale was at its lowest point. There were whispers among the settlers, whispers of returning to Earth, of abandoning this deadly world, and going back to the safety they knew. But not everyone agreed. Some believed that if they left now, they would be admitting defeat. They would be showing that they couldn't survive in a world that was trying to kill them. The thought of leaving everything behind, of giving up on the dream of building something new, was more terrifying than the world they were fighting to survive on. In the midst of all this, there was one thing that set humans apart from every other creature on this planet: their will to survive. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, and not the best adapted to this harsh world. But they had something that none of the creatures around them had: courage. They had determination. They had the ability to think and work together, something that none of the creatures on this world could do. The humans weren't just fighting against the deadly world around them. They were fighting against fear. They were fighting against the doubt that crept into their minds every night when they went to sleep, wondering if they would wake up the next morning. But every time they overcame an obstacle, every time they survived another deadly storm or outsmarted another predator, they grew stronger. They grew bolder. They began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could beat the odds. They could live on this deadly death world. But that wasn't certain. There were still so many dangers, so many unknowns. Even though the humans had come so far, the world still seemed intent on wiping them out. The creatures grew more aggressive. The storms became more violent. The plants seemed to get more toxic. It felt like the planet itself was testing them, pushing them to their limits. But the humans kept going. They kept fighting. And every time they did, they proved something important. That despite the dangers, despite the odds stacked against them, they would not give up. And so, the story of humans on this deadly Deathworld continued. Every day was a new challenge. Every day, the humans woke up knowing they had to face whatever the planet threw at them. But they weren't afraid, because they knew that if they could survive this, if they could conquer this world, they could survive anything. The deadly world was ruthless, but the humans were relentless. And that was what made them truly insane. They were willing to risk everything, to fight for survival, to live in a world that was out to destroy them. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to thrive. And in doing so, they proved to the planet that no matter how deadly it was, no matter how much it tried to break them, humans would never back down. The first challenge. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the human settlement. The air felt heavier today, a sign that something was coming. It was hard to tell, but anyone who had lived on this world for even a short time could feel the change in the wind. The people of the colony were accustomed to danger, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. In the distance, dark clouds began to gather. Not just any clouds. These were the kind that could destroy everything in their path. The colony had seen storms before, but this one felt different. The winds began to pick up, twisting violently through the trees, pulling at anything not tied down. The humans rushed to their homes, closing shutters and securing doors, knowing this could be the storm that would end everything. Inside the command center, the leaders of the settlement were already making plans. The weather reports were grim. A massive, Category 5 storm was headed directly toward them. The systems showed it would hit within hours. They had no time to evacuate, no time to run. This was their home, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. "The shelter's ready," said Commander Langley, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her heart. "We've got enough supplies to last through the worst of it. Everyone needs to stay inside and stay calm." But even as she spoke, she could hear the panic in the voices of the others. The storm wasn't just any force of nature, it was a monster. They had all seen its power before. Trees torn from the ground, buildings flattened, entire sections of the colony swallowed by the earth. And this time, it wasn't just the wind. It was the storm's lightning, a deadly force that could tear apart anything in its path. It wasn't just dangerous, it was unpredictable. No one knew exactly where it would hit or how much destruction it would cause. Outside, the storm began its approach. The first gusts of wind slammed into the colony, followed by a violent crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. The settlers scrambled to their shelters, their hearts racing with fear. They had prepared for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare them for the raw power of the storm. Suddenly, the first bolt of lightning struck, a blinding flash that illuminated the sky. It hit one of the power stations near the center of the colony, causing a massive explosion. The force sent shockwaves through the air, knocking out power across the settlement. The emergency systems kicked in, but it was clear this was not just a storm. This was a disaster in the making. As the wind howled louder and louder, tearing off the roofs of buildings and ripping trees from their roots, the humans inside their shelters were paralyzed with fear. They had trained for this, but seeing it happen in real time was different. The storm wasn't just coming for their homes, it was coming for their lives. The air felt electric, charged with an unnatural intensity that made it hard to breathe. Outside, the world had become a terrifying blur. The storm raged with a fury that no human could ever understand. The lightning came in quick bursts, flashing so often it felt like the sky itself was on fire. The wind howled, its force capable of lifting anything in its path. The ground beneath them cracked and trembled, threatening to swallow entire sections of the colony. Commander Langley stood in the shelter's command center, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she stared at the screens. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get to the emergency tunnels. Everyone, move." The signal was given, and the humans inside the shelter scrambled into action. The storm was already too powerful for them to wait any longer. They had no choice but to fight their fear and move quickly, heading for the emergency tunnels beneath the colony where they could ride out the worst of the storm. The storm continued its assault, its fury growing stronger with each passing minute. The tunnels beneath the colony were the only place they could go, the only place that could withstand the power of the winds and the lightning. As the last of the settlers descended into the tunnels, they could hear the world above them being torn apart. The roar of the storm seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, and yet they pressed on. Inside the tunnels, it was cold and dark, but they were safe, at least for now. But even as they huddled together, the storm outside continued its destructive path. It was clear that the colony, as strong as it had been, could not survive much longer in the face of such overwhelming power. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, there was a voice that called out from the darkness. "We can't just hide down here. We need to fight back." It was a young settler, one of the colony's engineers. His words hit like a lightning bolt of their own. For a moment, there was silence. Everyone had been so focused on survival that they hadn't even thought of fighting back. But this was what made humans different from the creatures on this world. They didn't just survive. They fought for their survival. The engineer continued, "We've got tools. We've got the knowledge. We can build something to withstand this storm. We can save the colony." Commander Langley looked at him, her heart pounding. Could they really do it? Could they turn the tide of the storm and save everything they had worked for? There was only one way to find out. She nodded, determination hardening in her eyes. "Let's do it." The humans were no longer just running from the storm. They were going to fight it. They would use everything they had, every skill, every tool, and every ounce of courage to survive. They might not have been the strongest or the fastest, but they had one thing no storm could take away: their will to survive. And as they gathered their tools and prepared to fight back, they realized something important. No matter how deadly this world was, no matter how powerful the storms, the humans would always find a way to push back, to survive, and to make this deadly Deathworld their home. The power of unity. The storm raged on, its howling winds pounding against the earth, as if it sought to erase everything in its path. The air was thick with tension, but within the emergency tunnels, a strange sense of purpose began to take root. The colony's survivors, huddled together in the dark, no longer felt the weight of fear. They felt the weight of something stronger: hope. It wasn't the hope of a miracle, but the hope that they could do something about their situation. The storm might have been monstrous, but it couldn't defeat the spirit of the humans who had built their lives here. Against all odds, the storm outside might have been chaos, but in the tunnels, something far more powerful began to take shape: unity. Commander Langley stood at the front of the group, her face illuminated only by the faint glow of emergency lights. Her eyes scanned the faces of the settlers around her, people she had led, people she had worked with, and now people she had to rally. She knew they were afraid. The storm had destroyed their homes, their shelters, their safety, but they were still here, still alive, and that meant something. "Everyone," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we're not going to just hide and wait for this storm to pass. We're going to fight for our home. Together, we have the skills, the knowledge, and the courage to survive. Now is the time to use all of it." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that spoke of fear. It was the silence before action. A young woman, Zoe, who had once been a farmer back on Earth, stepped forward. She was shaking, but her eyes burned with determination. "Commander, we got enough materials in the storage room. If we can create a barrier strong enough, we might be able to keep the wind and the lightning out. But we'll need to act quickly before the storm's worst hits." Langley nodded, her expression hardening. "Let's move. Everyone has a role to play. Engineers, get to the power supplies. Farmers, check the food supplies. We don't know how long we'll be in here. Medics, prepare for any injuries. We are in this together, and we will get through it together." It wasn't the first time they had worked together to survive. The settlers had always been a community, whether they were fixing machinery, growing food, or fending off the occasional predator. But now, in the face of such an overwhelming force, the need for unity was greater than ever. One by one, the humans filed out of the tunnels and into the small chamber where the emergency supplies were stored. The workers were efficient, organizing the materials into piles, ready to be used for the construction of a makeshift shield against the storm. As the storm's fury beat down above them, their movements were precise, working in tandem like a well-oiled machine. No one hesitated. No one doubted. As the settlers began to put their plan into motion, Langley watched with quiet pride. They were still a small group, but in that moment, they were an unstoppable force. Every person had a purpose. Every hand that reached for the tools. Every voice that shouted orders. Every eye that scanned the room. It was all part of a larger picture. The settlers worked through the night, their determination pushing them forward. The storm outside seemed to grow more intense with each passing hour, but within their improvised shelter, they were building something far stronger, a foundation for survival. Zoe and a group of engineers worked on reinforcing the walls of their underground shelter. They used thick sheets of metal and sturdy panels to create barriers, ensuring that no wind could tear them apart. They worked with a precision that showed their deep understanding of the world around them. Though they had never expected to face a storm this powerful, they adapted quickly, improvising solutions and using whatever materials they could find. Meanwhile, others worked on reinforcing the energy systems. They rigged power lines to ensure that even if the storm knocked out the main power source, they would have backup energy to keep essential systems running. The medics moved through the crowd, offering comfort and preparing for the worst. There were no moments of panic, no chaos. Everyone had a job to do, and they did it with the calm focus of people who had no choice but to succeed. As the storm continued its assault on the surface, the unity within the shelter grew. The settlers weren't just fighting the storm, they were fighting for each other. It wasn't enough to simply survive. They needed to protect their home, protect their future, and protect the lives of the people who had become more than just fellow settlers. They had become a family. As the night wore on, the first signs of the storm's retreat began to show. The winds calmed slightly, and the thunder rumbled farther in the distance. But the humans didn't let down their guard. They knew from experience that storms on this deadly world could change in an instant. By the time the storm had passed, the settlement was still standing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without damage. But the settlers had survived. More than that, they had stood together. The storm had tried to tear them apart, but they had fought back, side by side, until the very end. As the last of the winds died down, Langley gathered everyone in the main chamber. She looked at each of them, her heart swelling with pride. "This world may be trying to break us, but we proved something today," she said. "We may not be the strongest or the most powerful, but we have something that none of this can take away. Our unity, our will to survive. Together, we can take on anything." The settlers nodded, their faces glowing with pride. They were tired, covered in sweat and dirt, but they had done it. They had faced the worst this world had thrown at them, and they had survived. In that moment, they knew one thing for sure. As long as they had each other, there was nothing that could stop them. They weren't just surviving on a deadly world. They were thriving, and that was something the storm could never take away. The danger within. Just when the settlers thought the worst was behind them, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't the wind. This was something far worse. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the tunnels, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. The humans froze in place, their breath caught in their throats as the rumble grew louder and more intense. "What's happening?" Someone whispered in fear, their voice trembling. Commander Langley's eyes darted around the tunnel, trying to understand what was happening. The walls around them trembled as if something massive, something alive, was moving beneath the surface. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air felt thick with dread. The humans had survived the storm, but they knew this planet was full of deadly surprises, and this one was like nothing they had faced before. The shaking grew stronger, more violent, until suddenly the tunnel in front of them collapsed with a deafening crash. Dust and rocks filled the air, blinding the settlers. Langley shielded her eyes, her heart pounding. The ground rumbled again, but this time there was a sound, a low, growling hiss that made their blood run cold. From the darkness ahead, a shape emerged, moving faster than they could react. The creature was massive, its scales glistening like obsidian, its eyes glowing a fierce red as it locked onto its prey. It was a predator, and it was hungry. The humans had seen creatures like this before, ferocious beasts that lived in the wilds of the planet, but none like this one. This one was different. This one was relentless. It was a terror unlike anything they had ever imagined. "Run," Langley shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Everyone, get to the emergency exit. Now." The settlers scrambled, their minds racing. The tunnel had been their safe haven, their refuge from the dangers of the storm above. Now it had become a trap, a death sentence. The creature was gaining on them, its powerful claws scraping against the rocks as it closed the distance. The ground shook with each step it took, and the settlers had no choice but to run. Zoe, the young farmer, was the first to sprint toward the emergency exit. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her legs moved without thinking. Behind her, the others followed, each desperate to escape the creature that was now hunting them. But the tunnel was narrow, and the exit was far away. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. The creature let out a deafening roar, and Langley turned just in time to see it launch toward them. Its jaws were wide open, sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. It was a nightmare made flesh, and it was intent on killing them all. "Move, move, move," Langley shouted again, her voice hoarse with fear. They were so close to safety, just a few more steps, and they could escape into the open wilderness where they could regroup and fight back. But the creature was relentless, gaining on them with every step. As they neared the exit, Langley turned to see the massive beast barreling toward them. It was too fast. They wouldn't make it in time. And then, in the blink of an eye, one of the settlers, Jared, a veteran engineer, pushed forward. Without hesitation, he threw a makeshift explosive device directly in the creature's path. The explosion was deafening, throwing the creature backward and causing a massive tremor throughout the tunnel. Dust rained down, and for a moment, everything went silent. The creature staggered, disoriented, but not defeated. It hissed in fury, but Jared's actions had given the settlers a precious few seconds. Langley grabbed Zoe's arm and yanked her toward the exit. "Go, don't look back." They burst through the emergency exit and into the wild landscape outside, but the danger was far from over. They could hear the creature's furious roars echoing through the tunnels behind them, but the entrance was now blocked, and they were free, at least for the moment. Langley took a deep breath, her lungs burning from the sprint. The air was cooler here, and the starlit sky above them offered a brief moment of peace, but that peace was fleeting. The world outside was just as deadly as the one below, and the creature was not the only danger they had to worry about. "We need to regroup," Langley said, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. "Find shelter and make sure everyone is accounted for. We can't let this creature catch us off guard again." But even as she spoke, A thought lingered in the back of her mind. What had they just unleashed? The storm was over, but now they faced an even more terrifying threat. Something that wasn't just a natural disaster, but a creature that had learned to adapt to the world's dangers. This planet was testing them in ways they had never imagined, and they had no idea what else was lurking beneath the surface. The settlers had survived the storm. They had survived the worst of nature's fury. But this was something else. The creature wasn't just a predator. It was a warning. The world wasn't done with them yet. And the settlers, exhausted and fearful, realized one thing. They had to fight back. They couldn't just hide anymore. They had faced the storm and lived. Now they would face this new threat, and they would do it together. Because on this deadly Deathworld, survival was never a given. It was earned, and they had earned the right to live. The heroic sacrifice. The night was quiet, far too quiet. The chaos of the storm had passed, and the monstrous creature had been temporarily driven off, but peace seemed distant. The settlers huddled together in a hastily constructed shelter on the edge of the wilderness, their faces drawn and tired, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on their shoulders. They had escaped the storm. They had escaped the creature. But for how long? Commander Langley stood near the entrance, staring out into the darkness. She could hear the wind picking up again, the subtle hum of the planet's dangerous atmosphere. But it was the silence inside that worried her most. The settlers were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. Some were afraid to sleep, their eyes wide, their minds filled with the horror they had just witnessed. Others just sat there, numb to everything, unable to shake the fear of what might come next. Langley turned back to face the group, her gaze lingering on Jared, the engineer who had saved them all. He was sitting by the fire, his face ashen, his hand shaking despite the fire's warmth. He had been the one to plant the explosives, the one who had risked his life to buy them time. But now he was struggling. He knew that the creature was still out there, still hunting them, and every moment they wasted in this shelter was another moment it could find them. Langley, Jared said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, tired, but there was something else in it, something urgent. We can't stay here. We're just sitting ducks. The creature will come back. It's only a matter of time. Langley turned to him, meeting his eyes. She knew he was right, but the idea of leaving the shelter, venturing into the wilderness with the creature still out there, was terrifying. The storm had torn apart their home, and now this monster was hunting them. Every choice they made felt like a step toward death. I know, she said softly, but we need a plan. We can't just run blindly into the wild. We need to think this through. Just then, a voice from the back of the shelter interrupted the conversation. It was Zoe, the young farmer who had been with them from the beginning. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with determination. Langley, I think I have a plan. I've been thinking about how we can outsmart it. If we use the environment against the creature, set traps, create false trails, we might be able to drive it away. But we'll need everyone working together. The room went silent, the settlers all turning toward her. Zoe had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to stay in the background, tending to crops and gathering food. But now she was speaking with a confidence that made Langley pause. Could this work? Could they truly outsmart the creature? Langley nodded slowly. All right, let's hear it. We need every advantage we can get. Zoe outlined her plan, explaining how they could use the terrain to confuse the creature, how they could lure it into traps and set false trails to lead it away from the shelter. It was a risky plan, one that required perfect timing and teamwork, but it was the only chance they had. The settlers worked through the night, preparing. They gathered everything they could. Makeshift weapons, supplies for traps, and whatever materials they had left from the storm. They knew this would be their one shot. If they failed, the creature would tear through their shelter and wipe them out. As the sun began to rise, casting an eerie light over the alien landscape, the group made their way out into the wilderness. The plan was set in motion. They would use the terrain to their advantage, baiting the creature into a trap. They had worked together, coordinated every move, but there was one thing they hadn't prepared for: the creature's intelligence. As they laid their final trap, everything went wrong. The creature appeared from the shadows, its red eyes gleaming in the light of the rising sun. It had tracked them, and it was faster than they had anticipated. Before they could react, it lunged, its massive claws slashing through the air. In a split second, Jared stepped forward, pushing Langley out of the way. He was faster than the creature, but not fast enough. The creature's jaws snapped shut around his leg, pulling him to the ground with terrifying strength. Langley shouted in horror, but Jared only smiled weakly up at her, his face pale with pain. "Go," he gasped. "Get out of here. It's too late for me." Langley's heart slammed against her chest. "No, Jared, we can still." But Jared shook his head, his grip on her hand loosening. "It's my turn to protect you. You can't fight it. Not this way. You have to survive. You have to make it out of here. Tell everyone. Tell everyone I did my part." With that, he used his last bit of strength to pull a detonator from his pocket and slammed it into the ground. The explosion was deafening, filling the air with the sound of shattering rock and twisted metal. The creature howled in rage and pain, but it was too late. The blast sent it tumbling back into the dark forest, leaving the settlers stunned and silent. Langley fell to her knees beside Jared, tears streaming down her face. "Why? Why did you do it?" Jared's eyes were soft, filled with a calm acceptance. "Because someone had to, and I couldn't let you die." The rest of the group gathered around, their faces a mixture of grief and awe. They had just lost one of their own, but in his sacrifice, Jared had given them a chance. He had given them life. As they made their way back to the shelter, Langley carried Jared's memory with her. She knew that this world might never let them live in peace, that dangers would always come from the shadows. But now, more than ever, she understood what it meant to survive. It wasn't just about staying alive. It was about the choices they made, the sacrifices they were willing to accept, and the love and loyalty they shared as a community. Jared had shown them what it meant to be truly heroic. And in that moment, Langley knew they couldn't just survive. They would live, and they would fight for every second they had left. The Great Escape. The sun had barely risen, casting a dim light over the shattered landscape. The storm had passed. The creature was gone. For now. But the survivors of the colony knew that they couldn't stay in this broken shelter for long. Every corner, every shadow felt like a reminder that the planet wasn't done with them yet. They had lost a brave soul in Jared, and the weight of his sacrifice hung over them like a dark cloud. But amidst the pain and the grief, there was something else rising: determination. Langley stood at the front of the group, her eyes scanning the horizon. The alien wilderness stretched endlessly before them, a land of dangers they had only begun to understand. But there was a way out, a path they could take to the safety of the high cliffs to the north. The journey would be treacherous, and it would test them in ways they hadn't yet faced, but it was their only hope. It was time for the settlers to escape the Deathworld. "Gather your things," Langley ordered, her voice clear and unwavering. "We move at dawn." The settlers, exhausted and emotionally drained, packed what little they had left. Supplies were low, and they couldn't afford to carry anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every bag was heavy, not just with provisions, but with the weight of all that had happened. But there was no time to mourn. Not yet. They had to survive. As they began their journey, the wilderness around them seemed to watch, its strange, ever-shifting landscape both beautiful and deadly. The ground was rough, filled with jagged rocks and sharp, alien plants that seemed to reach out as if they had a life of their own. Every step they took felt like it could be their last, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The air was thick with tension, every noise amplified in the silence. The predators that lurked in the shadows had not forgotten them. The creature they had faced yesterday had been just one of many threats. In this world, danger was everywhere, but so was the will to survive. Langley knew that they couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, or they would become prey. They had to keep pushing forward, toward the cliffs, toward the safety they hoped lay beyond. Hours passed. The landscape shifted. They crossed alien forests where the trees seemed to move with the wind, their leaves whispering warnings to those who dared to walk beneath them. They passed through wide valleys where the air smelled of sulfur and strange minerals. Yet, as they journeyed further, Langley couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she liked. She wasn't sure if it was the remnants of their fear or something more sinister, but one thing was clear: the planet had not forgotten them. It was waiting. Nightfall arrived, and they set up camp under the shadow of a giant cliff. The sky was dark, the stars distant and cold. The survivors huddled around a small fire, their faces tired but determined. There was no more time for fear. The only thing that mattered was reaching the cliffs, where they might find a way off this world. Langley stood by the fire, watching the flames flicker in the cool night air. She knew they couldn't stay here long. The predators would be out soon, hunting. But they needed a plan, a way to make it through the last leg of their journey without falling victim to the dangers that still lurked. It was Zoe who spoke first, breaking the silence. "Langley, there's something I need to tell you. I've been thinking about the way out, and I believe we can use the cliffs to our advantage. If we can scale them and set up camp on the higher ledges, we'll be out of the creatures' reach. But it won't be easy. The climb will be dangerous, and the creatures here are more aggressive at night. We'll need to move quickly." Langley nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. "All right, we'll move at first light. Everyone needs to be ready to climb. This is our chance, and we can't waste it." The group spent the rest of the night preparing, each person checking their gear and getting as much rest as they could. But sleep didn't come easy. Every rustling leaf, every whisper of wind made them tense, made them question whether this was their last night on the planet. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, they were resolute. They would make it. They had no choice. At dawn, they set off toward the cliffs, moving with the silent urgency of people who knew that time was running out. The climb ahead was steep, and the rocks were sharp and treacherous, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. One by one, they began to scale the cliffs, helping each other up when the climb became too difficult. Every hand, every footstep, was a testament to their determination to survive. But just as they neared the top, disaster struck. The ground trembled again, and the creatures, emerged from the shadows, more numerous than they had imagined. A pack of them, their red eyes gleaming, their jaws snapping in hunger, surrounded the settlers. The humans had no choice but to fight, to keep climbing and hope they could reach the top before the creatures tore them apart. "Move," Langley shouted. "Get to the top now." The climb became a desperate scramble, with the settlers doing their best to fend off the creatures as they scaled the cliffside. Zoe, with her farmer's strength and quick thinking, used her makeshift tools to fend off the creatures, her heart pounding in her chest. The others followed, adrenaline pushing them forward. They could hear the growls and snarls of the creatures behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top. They collapsed on the rocky ledge, their bodies exhausted but alive. The creatures had retreated, unwilling to climb to such heights. They had made it. The path to safety was clear, at least for now. Langley looked around at the group, her breath heavy, her heart still racing. "We did it. We're safe, for now." But she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The high cliffs offered them safety from the predators below, but they still had to find a way off this deadly planet. And as they sat together, gazing out over the alien wilderness, they understood one thing. They had survived the worst, and they would continue to survive, no matter what. They had escaped, and no creature, no storm, No world could take that away. The final victory. The wind howled through the high cliffs, whipping the settlers' faces with sharp gusts as they sat on the rocky ledge, catching their breath. Their bodies were bruised and battered from the climb, their muscles sore from days of running, fighting, and struggling to survive. But as they looked out at the vast, alien landscape before them, so different from Earth, yet eerily beautiful, they felt something new, something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time since they had arrived on this planet, they were not just survivors. They were conquerors. Langley stood up slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged mountains in the distance, casting long shadows over the land. The air here was cold, but it felt pure. Free. They had made it to the cliffs, the place they had dreamed of reaching. And in doing so, they had proven something important. No matter how deadly the world had been, no matter how many times it tried to crush them, they had fought back and triumphed. "We did it," Langley whispered to herself, though it felt like the words were meant for the group more than anyone else. Zoe, sitting beside her, looked out at the same view, her eyes reflecting the distant light. "It's not over, Langley. We're not safe yet. We still don't know what's next for us." Langley nodded, understanding the weight in Zoe's words. They had escaped the creatures, outsmarted the storm, and fought through every danger the world had thrown at them. But they still didn't know what awaited them on this alien world, or how long it would take to rebuild. They had lost so much along the way. People, resources, time. Yet, despite everything, they were still standing. And in that moment, standing on the edge of this dangerous new world, they knew that survival wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They had fought for every inch of ground they had gained. But now, the next chapter began. They weren't just going to survive anymore. They were going to live. As the night fell, the stars above twinkled like distant beacons of possibility. The group gathered around a small fire they had managed to start, the warmth of it comforting against the chill of the night air. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for. A reminder that they were not alone, and that together they could face anything. Langley sat with the others, the weight of Jared's sacrifice still heavy in her heart, but no longer something that could break her. His memory was with them, fueling their determination. They had lost comrades along the way, and each loss had tested their resolve. But in their hearts, they knew that every person who had fallen had left behind a legacy. They had died fighting, not just for themselves, but for the future of everyone who had come to this world seeking a new life. "What now?" asked Jared's closest friend, Marco, his voice filled with uncertainty. Langley looked around at her people, these brave souls who had become a family over the course of their struggle. They were stronger now than they had ever been, and they had made it farther than they ever thought possible. There was still fear, still doubt, but there was something else too, a fire in their eyes, a promise that they would not give up. "We rebuild," Langley said, her voice steady and strong. "We rebuild because we're more than just survivors. We're humans, and no matter how deadly this world is, we won't let it take us down. We'll keep moving forward." The settlers nodded in agreement, the weight of the words sinking in. They would rebuild. They would thrive, not just on this planet, but in their hearts. They had learned the hardest lesson possible, that to survive in a world like this, they had to be more than just resilient. They had to be bold. They had to be unbreakable. As the fire crackled and the stars above shone brightly, Langley allowed herself a moment of peace. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. But that was okay, because they were ready. Ready to face whatever came next. They had learned to overcome the impossible. They had learned to live on a world that was meant to destroy them. And with that, the settlers of the colony stood together, no longer just hoping for survival. They were now fighting for their future, for their lives. And they knew one thing for sure. They were unstoppable. This deadly Deathworld would no longer be their enemy. it would be their home. And no matter what the universe threw at them, they would never give up. Because humans were insane. And that, it turned out, was exactly what they needed to conquer this deadly world.